This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Dario Llinares, who is himself a film critic, academic and podcaster. He, along with Neil Fox, has been the host of the Cinematologists podcast, and he is currently editing and contributing to a book which studies podcasting and film specifically. It's a wide-ranging conversation. We talk about a lot of different things, and it's possibly the most meta conversation we've had yet, because we talk so much about podcasts and cinema and the interaction between the two, and also film culture in the age of social media. Really sort of quite knotty, spicy, and a word I hate, as you will know, problematic issues. So if you like the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, share as far and wide as possible. I rely on you very much to get these episodes out to as wide a listening audience as possible. But before you do any of that, let's just enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that podcasting can be an evolving criteria. So you might start off, I think, as you did, interviewing people who have definitely written a book, and a book on film, obviously. But then, if that becomes more and more, if it becomes more harder to get people who have literally just released something and they want to talk about it kind of fresh, then opening the criteria to people who've written an article, or just people want to talk about the idea of writing. You know, you can expand that as much as you want, I suppose, over time.
Yeah, I mean, I've already done a couple of screenwriters, and I'm quite happy to open it up to screenwriters or to anyone who's kind of like, as you say, has written articles or written, I mean, Peter Bradshaw was on a few months ago, and he had actually written a book, but the book was essentially a compilation of reviews. It wasn't like a previously published material, so it wasn't quite what I would sort of consider a film book. But yeah, he's obviously such a great guy to talk to, because he's dominated certainly the popular sort of print reviewing of cinema for probably a decade or so now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think possibly he took over the sort of Philip French mantle in print. As you say, sort of 10 years ago. But then it's interesting how the different forms of criticism overlapping, and I suppose we'll get to talking about that. So you look at somebody like Mark Kermode who jumps across. He's probably more famous for the radio work and now the podcasting work. But then Peter Bradshaw, does his vlogs on social media and was on the Guardian podcast when that was kind of around a lot more than it is now. So, this idea, again, possibly what we're going to talk about today, of what is film writing, is now almost a sort of existential question, if you want to get philosophical about it,
Because, we do, definitely. Yeah. Let's get philosophical.
Indeed. Yeah. So it's an interesting thought to think about these ideas of where do we engage in criticism, and how does the form itself inform what criticism actually is.
Yeah. How did you come about? What's your sort of beginning in sort of both film and in podcasting?
Well, I've got an academic background, really. I did my undergrad degrees were in cultural studies. My undergrad was film studies. My master's and PhD were then cultural studies, which, again, sometimes it's a quite an abstract term that to define what is cultural studies. But I suppose, again, just to sort of define that very quickly, it's kind of like a branch of sociology, but instead of looking at the data around people, you are actually analyzing the things that people produce, whether it's films or books or whatever. So cultural, the cultural output of people and how that defines how society is understood, represented, and then you can get into things like ideological criticism. So how do the things that we see in culture sort of define our sense of presentation of what things are like? And then that kind of aligns with things like notions of representation, like gender and race and class and ability and all of that kind of stuff. So that was sort of my master's and PhD background. And then I was working part-time in Leeds at both Leeds University and the Polytechnic there, which is now Leeds Beckett University. And I was teaching lots of different cultural studies and sociology type courses, which included film courses. And then I got my first job down at Falmouth University in the film department there, which is a combination course. So it's theory and practice. And I was doing the theory side of the course. And then maybe I think sort of 2 or 3 years later, Neil came down and we struck up a friendship. And it was around sort of 2014, 2015. And this was the time when podcasting was sort of having its sort of crossover moment. I think a lot of people have written about this idea, so including myself. So that idea that both in a technological sense, podcasting migrated from pods to phones. Apps came along, so you could download immediately the podcast to the phone, through Wi-Fi, and that suddenly facilitated the ease of listening, because there were so many things you had to do to listen to a podcast before that moment. And then at the same time, Serial came along, which was probably the first podcast that was kind of pushed on like late night TV shows as being an event. And these two things kind of combined to create or instigate the move into kind of mainstreaming of podcasting, which has kind of continued to the point where it is now, where it's becoming, institutionalized and platformized in a way that's bringing it almost back to the criteria of broadcast media that radio, TV, and film are. But yeah, we can talk about those. So we started podcasting around that time, and I've been doing it ever since with the Cinematologists.
Yeah, and brilliantly as well. I mean, your podcast is a sort of what's the word for it? Well, I mean, it's a fun way of getting yourself educated, I would say. It's sort of like has that depth, but it's also very accessible and approachable.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that we do aim for. I mean, we had a lot of influences from different podcasts, some that were kind of like what I'd call borrowing from the radio magazine format. So, you have your box office top 10 and then your special guest and then movie reviews. And that was already out there. And then there were other forms of podcasts that were kind of aping the live Q&A. So they would be recorded live and, the Q&A would just be recorded. And then obviously we've got our history of teaching in seminars, the seminar situation as a kind of, if you think of the kind of ancient Greek echoes of that, where you're all sitting around sort of musing on what things mean and this kind of thing. And then, obviously there are pleasures of cinematic engagement related to things like the pre-film anticipation and then the post-film chat. And all of these things kind of, I think, feed into the idea of what podcasts can do. And we were trying to bring all of those things, depending on the episode, because we do change formats. I mean, it's quite different, I think, to like a podcast like this one, which has got a very clear theme and a clear intent when it comes to, I'm going to interview people who've written a book. So that's quite straightforward, which is great, and I think that it feeds that idea of podcasting being aimed at niche audiences. But we, from the beginning, have always been quite eclectic and ready to change formats and change subjects. I mean, again, at the beginning of a season, we have no idea what we're going to cover half the time. But I think, people sort of, oh, they're doing that this week, or oh, that's interesting. And sometimes it can be quite populist stuff, and other times it can be, very unusual or unknown films or filmmakers that we might cover. And that seems to have worked for us. I mean, again, people have told us this is sort of anecdotal, but I've said that we are kind of unique in the film podcast space in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember the podcasts I would listen to at the very beginning would be things like, well, I listened to the Slash filmcast,
Right.
which was an extremely, I think definitely had that sort of mates in a pub feel of
Sure.
a very casual conversation and not particularly sort of rigorous intellectually in terms of, the guys were fans, and I think that I don't think they would in any way sort of be offended by that. Um, and I always found myself, and because there were three of them as well, it was quite a good one because you could always align yourself with one or the others, and that was that also had that feeling of mates in a cafe or something.
Gotcha.
And then the Q&A one that you mentioned, that's there was a guy who did a screenwriting podcast where he very much concentrated. Jeff Goldsmith, I want to say.
Okay, no, I know the name. Yeah.
And he was big Hollywood guy. He had his own script writing magazine.
Script Notes. It could be Script Notes that possibly I can't remember.
Anyway. He might well, because this was many years ago, so he might well have changed format since I was listening to him. But I just remember he would basically always try to get script writers, usually around about release day, and so he would be and often at screenings, often it would be a Q&A that had been organized in Los Angeles. So it was so that was always good. And then the other one was, and again, this is right at the very beginning, was Film Weekly, which was the Guardian with Jason Solomons.
Sure, yeah, I remember that one.
And I thought the Guardian were absolutely bonkers in discontinuing that, because it was absolutely my go-to sort of weekly program.
Yeah.
I mean, I've listened to Commode and Simon Mayo, but and they're great, they're fine, nothing wrong with them, but they are very much, and now the traffic, they're very much catering to that audience, and so there's a limit to how kind of highbrow or lowbrow you can be. You have to be very middlebrow.
Yeah, I mean, they've been extremely successful and extremely popular, and I listened to them in maybe earlier on in their incarnation, the first sort of 10 years, because what was really interesting about them, again, I think they're formative for podcasting, particularly in the UK, not necessarily just because of the content, but because they were the first show that I can remember where it was like, it's on a Friday afternoon. I think it used to be Thursday, and then it changed to a Friday afternoon, 2 till 4, and I couldn't listen because I was working. But then they were remediated. So this is one of the elements of podcasting, what it does, it allows radio shows to become remediated, and you could listen to them later on. And then obviously, we take that for granted now, but the idea that you would listen to something not at the appointed time is actually still quite a new phenomenon. You know what I mean? And it's led us into this era where we curate our content as much as anything else. So it's a labor that's involved in defining what we want to listen to, and we have to find ways, and lots of people have different ways of doing that. Still the most important one, I think, in podcasting is recommendations, but now with the development of apps and different types of listening apps, there is this sort of move to solve what's known as the discoverability problem in podcasting, and that's been exacerbated by the fact that you have the gatekeeping that takes place with big tech companies buying up talent. So you think about Spotify now, and previous to that, the different individual media companies. I mean, Luminary was this first company that wanted to be the Netflix of podcasting. So there's this kind of like move back to a sort of channel structure when it comes to podcasting, when originally it was just like a free-for-all. Even Apple, the interesting thing about Apple was they didn't produce anything, and they weren't interested in that. But with iTunes, it became the conduit through which podcasting kind of emerged as this independent medium. So it was really weird that you had this huge corporate entity that weren't actually interested in monetizing the content at all. All they're interested is selling the hardware. So that allowed, in a really weird way, a sort of arena for independent and experimental work in sound that they weren't touching. They weren't trying to monetize. Just like, yeah, put your work up there. But suddenly now we've got to the point where it's going back to a much more sort of channel broadcast focused kind of approach when you think of the money that's going into it from big companies.
Do you think, I mean, there's an element of, gatekeepers, and there's also an element of, I haven't got time to I haven't got time to commission my own, entertainment and cultural needs. I grew up with 3 TV channels,
me too.
and I was fine. There was some, Wednesday night was Tomorrow's World, and there wasn't much else on, but we managed. I know that's more problematic when it comes to things, as you say, like diversity and representation, which you mentioned at the beginning. But kind of, don't we need gatekeepers? Don't we need? I mean, isn't the argument not against gatekeepers per se, but who the gatekeepers are and what the criteria they use?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but gatekeepers are always going to come from a specific ideological position. So if it's for example, if it's the BBC, you can say that they've over their history have done, I don't know how to say, because it is, you can criticize it. They've done a good job of trying to embody that Reithian kind of approach, they entertain, educate, inform type idea. And, you look at the comparison, is that better? Is that sort of having one body do all of that? And you have to sort of understand British culture, you'd have to watch the BBC to sort of get, because they're so intertwined, the idea of ourselves does come through this one body. Is that better or worse than, say, the American model with NPR, or the public service broadcasting, and which is much more diffuse and has all of these different types of individualized, atomized or entities within that, and there isn't one thing kind of pushing a specific agenda. And you could argue that there are pros and cons to each of them. And then you look at other areas. Most countries in Europe have a public service broadcaster of a sort, and how much does that reflect the prevailing government's needs, if you want to put it that way. And obviously you can push that to the far end when you get to propaganda and authoritarian regimes controlling the media. So gatekeeping is always an issue. And you also have the problem of now, especially in the internet era, where we tend to see that there is this atomization, this is fracturing of where we get our content from, that if there is no gatekeeping, it's kind of like out of control, the notion of where content comes from and where it goes to. And just the fact that the internet is open source and was designed that way has led to the problems of things like privacy that we've got now, and the issues with the sort of neo-feudalism in terms of the thing that garners the most listens, or the most people are attracted to most is controversy, essentially. So because there isn't that filtering process that you're talking about when it comes to gatekeeping, so there is pros and cons around that. And we could talk about things like canonization as well, which is a key thing. I've just filled in my Sight and Sound top 10 poll, and again, they're trying to diversify that out, but again, that is a process of kind of gatekeeping or setting a canon of what they consider to be the greatest movies of all time, which is an interesting process to go through.
I think it's going to be very controversial when they bring that out. I think it's going to be
this time round. You mean?
Yeah. Because I think it's going to be really, really different from.
I think it will be
the last year, just because of the number of people. They've lowered the bar so much that I was involved as well. How ridiculous can you be? And when I was, that's really interesting. Because I've had conversations with quite a few writers and quite a few people who have been preparing their top 10. And the very idea of a top 10 is just, I made a top 100 for Letterboxd for my students, just to say, here's 100 films that I think are really worth watching if you're interested in film, if you're interested in, and that I love, that not definitive or anything like that, but just from my personal point of view. And already that list is now 120, 125. And I looked at it last night and just thought, actually, I should add some, there's no so-and-so in there. There's no such and such. So 10 is just like, it really is almost random. It really. What were your criteria? What criteria did you use for choosing?
Yeah, well, what I tried to do was think about films that were formative to me, but also I could die on a hill saying that they had some kind of major impact on cinema, historically or aesthetically or in terms of industry.
I'm not going to ask you for your 10 films because that would obviously be. But which film do you feel you will most likely have to die on that hill? Which was the one that you chose and you thought, this one is going to be a tough argue. I mean, I can do it, but it's going to be a tough.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean,
I can give you mine, by the way.
Go on. You go first. Let me.
Okay. So this is where my bias came in, or where my criteria sort of shifted a little bit, because I was really intent on not trying to show off my film knowledge. And if I have one weakness as a critic or a viewer, or one attribute that could be perceived as a weakness, is that I tend to just like a heck of a lot of stuff. And if you ask me what's my favorite film, I mean, it would generally hover around Casablanca or 2001 or but not like, oh, that's a surprise. It's like, well, that's a lot of people's favorite films. So I decided I would try to lean towards recent films, even though I have, my favorite films are usually 1930s or before, but I would try to lean towards more recent films. So this is a long-winded answer, but I was thinking of Lawrence of Arabia as one of my top 10. And then I thought, well, what's a more recent film which is in a similar sort of boys' adventure, epic scale, grandeur, historical period piece sort of thing. And I thought, well, Master and Commander would be the film that I would... And one of the other things I wanted was a film that if somebody said, do you want to watch this right now? I would say yes, without hesitation. Yeah. And there's only one exception to that in my list, but which is Showa. So just to be completely frank, I've
got an equivalent of Showa. It's not Showa, but I've got an equivalent of that in my list, which people will be like, "Oh, right, okay."
So Master and Commander is the one that I thought, this is the one that people will go, well, you're not taking this seriously,
Right, I see what you mean. I don't think there's one in my list that I would say is, what people could say, oh, well, that's just frivolous. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which I don't think. I mean, Master and Commander was great. I mean, I actually watched that on a plane, and it was the perfect environment because with the turbulence, and it was like a physical experience watching it. So it was great. But yeah, I suppose there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, I'll give one of my films is Holy Motors, which is the Leos Carax movie from is it 2008? I think now it's just gone out of my head when he made that. But I suppose that
it's about 2012, I think.
I can't
recent.
Remember suddenly off the top of my head.
No, it's fine.
It's a film that I watched at a festival. I've never even seen a Carax movie before, and it was just kind of like, oh, this looks really weird and interesting. I went in and just kind of blew my mind in a way that I couldn't focus on anything. Everything else that I saw at that festival was just crap, I thought, in comparison, just because it just did so much. And I suppose, though, that you could say here is somebody who is using a lot of surrealist and abstract kind of thematics, but then drawing on his cine literacy, somebody who's very much kind of interested in the history of cinema. And then it just, at the end, it kind of goes off the reservation. And this is the kind of movie which I like, where I want to be in a movie one day where everybody, the audience is full, everybody walks out apart from me. because I know it's a masterpiece. Do you know what I mean? It's like that sort of self-centeredness. And I think it's the kind of movie where quote unquote, again, this is really sort of reductive, but an ordinary film goer would be just kind of like, what is that? And I think that's the interesting thing. I was listening to a podcast where they weren't film people, and they were just talking about, I'll go. I don't want to go and see that. Why would I go to the movies when I can just sit at home and watch it? And I think that, people who are very much cinephiles or define themselves are a very different breed than ordinary film goers. And I know that's kind of reductive, but I think there is something to that. And that's the kind of film where, an ordinary film goer a lot of the time would be like, this is just insanity. Do you know what I mean? And, and I think you could sell, like, say, for example, very close to my top 10, but not in it was Jaws, because I think Jaws is a seminal film for various reasons, on various criteria. You can talk about industry, even before Star Wars, it was the blockbuster summer movie. It kind of designed that, it's a film that took a lot of classical Hollywood aesthetic ideas and structural ideas, and then add into that the sort of Hitchcock element of it, and sort of announce this idea that here was a return to these sort of fundamental old Hollywood notions of storytelling that were being projected onto contemporary filmmaking back in the 70s, after the era of New Hollywood. So that could easily be on my top 10 list. But yeah, I mean, it's impossible to narrow it down.
What sort of was it disqualified just because, I just don't have room, I'm not willing to give up anything to put it in?
Yeah, again, it's just about room. It's interesting because it's like I did a little bit like you. It's kind of like how many films could I put into the mix, let's say, of what could be on the top 10. And mine was a lot narrower than that. I mean, it's interesting you say, and I think Neil, who I podcast with, he's quite similar to you in that he loves a lot of stuff. Right? And I'm much more, I try to be much more kind of clear about why I like something. Not that, that you guys are not, but it's kind of like, yeah, I like it, but it's not going to get anywhere near a sort of top 20 or top 50 that I like. Do you see what I mean? So yeah. I probably had about between 30 and 50 films that I would consider for me, and then added in that extra criteria of I could argue for this being important in movie history in some way.
I think there's a real difference to be made between enjoyment and something being actually good. I mean, there's a lot of shit that I love, and there's lots of stuff that I think I love for nostalgic reasons. And then when you watch them sort of in the cold light of day with the lights on, if you like, you say, well, I mean, I think this is an example I might have brought up in the past, but like James Bond movies, I really love James Bond movies. I have a great time in them, but they're almost, with only very few exceptions, they're almost all terrible as movies.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, I was just interviewing someone for a book that I'm doing on podcasting. And it was basically somebody who's
Writers on Film episode 2.
Yeah, indeed. Well, this is an edited book, so I'm not writing the whole thing. So it's kind of, but I have got chapters in there. So, but they are a fan podcaster. And, we were talking about their PhD project, which was on Doctor Who and Harry Potter fan podcasts, basically.
Right.
So it was on this idea of, it was on the idea of podcasts being, and fan podcasts particularly, being a sort of new form of public pedagogy. So people learning about things like politics and race and gender through their love of these shows, right? And then podcasting about them, right? That researcher was very much from the wing of thought of everything is subjective. There is no good and bad, because I would argue, I can't watch Doctor Who. And this is why it was an interesting conversation, because I respect what this person was saying, but I can't watch it and the criteria for why is I I don't feel it speaks to me as being an older adult. I think, you know,
Right.
a lot of like young adult fiction and young adult TV.
It's not because you were traumatized by it as a child.
No, not at all.
That's my reason.
Yeah. No, it's not my cup of tea. And also, I think that there are one, again, if you're defining criteria of good and bad, I think sometimes my way of doing that is to say, is this formulaic? Is this just repeating something that I would expect to see? And therefore, that would be I've seen this before. It's just repackaged. And, you know, you could argue that most art and culture is repackaged forms. But it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. What do you think of that question? Do you think that there is ever a kind of objective, a possibility of saying this is objectively good and this is objectively bad?
I would argue that there are sort of I would try to get away from the binary of objective subjective and just and say there is objective, there's subjective, and there's a subjectivity that we all agree on, and there's a sort of a consensus in the same way, you know, we agree on the meaning of certain words. And so even if there's nothing, there's no gold that is behind the promissory note of our discourse, then that note still has value if we all agree it has value. So I think we can talk about things. I think there are convincing arguments to do on various levels. I think you can argue on a level of basic competency. I think there are certain films you can look at and you can just say that's badly edited, it's badly made, it does things which are incoherent, but not in a way which is intended or creative. Well, leave aside intended, let's just say creative, so we don't get into that. I think you can say the same thing on a sort of moral ground. I think there are certain ways of seeing things which are immoral, and again, similarly to what we're talking about in terms of aesthetics and taste and whether something is good or bad as a work of art. Likewise, good and bad as a morality is something which I would try to use a sort of tripartite system of thinking about, rather than just simply, I think the thing that, it can't be objective is a bit of a straw man. I think there are plenty of things in life that there is no objective out there in the reality. If human beings didn't exist, it would still exist thing, right down to the basics like color and sound. If everybody disappeared, there would be no more color in the universe, because color is not something which is out there. It's about our interaction and interfacing with something that is out there. So without that one ingredient, then the whole concept falls to pieces. So in that sense, I would argue very much. And the thing about that kind of consensual subjectivity, I mean, I don't know if that's a phrase, but I'm going to use it anyway, is that we have to talk about it as if it's objective.
Yeah. There has to be an aspiration towards the idea that this sets up itself somehow as being available to be read by a group of people who can then agree on what it is. But the problem, I mean, again, I don't disagree, but also there is the counter argument that anything then gets produced is a product of the conditions and the people who produce it. So therefore, anything that becomes available to be read is only available to be read within the context of the society or the time that it is. So like, say, for example, just as a quick example, I know it was a bit sort of abstract what I said there, but the idea that, at some point jazz was considered a lowbrow form of art and now it's super highbrow, or opera is the same, and you get this idea of films that come out and then later on they're reappraised in different contexts. So that adds to that idea of it just depends on the context in which they emerge, and then the context in which they evolve into. And also as I sort of said there, the sense in which whenever something comes out, it's emerging out of a context of people who can make those things. So, the critique of a lot of the canon is that it's very white and very male and very straight. And those are the stories and that's the issue with the Sight and Sound poll. So whenever then you're trying to set up what your consensus of subjectivity is, as you said, you're always beholden to that sense of, yeah, but there's only a certain group of people who are allowed to have that conversation of subjectivity, in the past. So it's that it's always going to be a difficult thing, I think.
Yeah, I would counter that by saying that the influence of sort of, it's the old Marx idea of the ruling ideas of any epoch of the ideas of the ruling class. And so it doesn't have to even be the government, it can be elites, it can be whatever. That's kind of true, but it's also kind of countered by Marx himself, with his sort of looking at coming from Hegel and the idea that everything has within itself its antithesis. So, capitalism creates the very instability which will destroy it or transform it. It's doing pretty well at the instability bit, not very well at the revolution at the moment. It has to be said. So I would argue that it's just much more complex than the monolithic. So going back to something like the BBC. Yes, the BBC might have these. The DG might have a certain set of affiliations. The people around him might all be educated by Oxbridge. We have. I love someone like Marina Hyde in The Guardian and her critiques, but she's absolutely establishment,
Yeah, of course.
She used to write for The Sun, for crying out loud. So you have these, this, as you say, sort of establishment, or you have this ruling ideology. But having said that, once you get on the field, once you get on into the mud of actually talking about it, arguing about it, then it is incredibly exciting and invigorating about how people get listened to because of the originality of thought, and because of they have new ideas, and because they have and in its attempt not to be propaganda, not to be purely a mouthpiece for the powers that be, then there is plenty of room, maybe not enough, maybe we've always got to be fighting to get more, but there is room for really original, interesting, oppositional, critical voices to come out. I would argue that the idea that jazz or opera is sort of elitist is a very superficial. I don't mean I just mean even that idea is really, really superficial, and you only need to investigate it slightly for that to break out. And I'm coming from a working class background, and I love jazz and I love classical music, and I always have done. So it took me 5 minutes of listening to Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and John Coltrane and then that going off for me to go, oh, this is for me. This isn't elitist at all. And the same thing with Puccini and Verdi and opera. So I would argue that all those arguments I've sort of gone with my I've heard, and I to some degree think there is validity in them, but I think they're they have too much of a view of the universe and creativity as systemic. And we're looking at, Marx will say this as well, the infrastructure, the superstructure, and all this sort of, and it uses, you can tell who people are by the analogies they use. And they use these analogies which are very inorganic and very, solid. Sorry, go on. I've been
I totally agree with that, and I think that it's half the battle today. In the culture that we're in, being able to look with the kind of pure eyes at the work. You know what I mean? With an acknowledgement of where the work has come from, and how that could make it problematic. It's the ideology versus aesthetics argument. It's the separate the artist from the art argument, which I think what's interesting about what you've just said there, I think that we've moved into a place where it's not kind of like elites or governments telling us what we can't or can't like. It's, like I say, sort of groups of tribes these days. You know what I mean? And again, I don't want to kind of say that it's problematic that we shouldn't reflect on what we see. We definitely should, and say, okay, well, this is problematic for these reasons. But I think, we have to engage with things like, what is the intent? What do you think? What, when it comes to assessing whether something is good or not, what is the intention? Is it doing what it sets out to do? Like you could watch The Wire and say that's the greatest television show of all time, and add a load of aesthetic and thematic and cultural criteria to that to make that argument. But then you could, the people who watch Love Island and say, well, this is wonderful stuff because it actually feeds something to my experience and I get joy and pleasure out of it. We can't forget about the idea of, even as critics, the idea of joy and pleasure within the work. And then, what's so interesting, I have this lecture that I give to the students at the beginning, when they first come in as film students, and you always different types of film students, and they all want to sort of establish themselves as having a kind of kudos within the group,
Yeah, who's the John Bender of the group?
Basically, well, it's that kind of thing, but it's also kind of like whose values in terms of what they like in cinema is preeminent. So I'll put up, you put up a slide and say, okay, which is the better film, 2001: A Space Odyssey or the Hangover Part 2? And that's feeding into that dichotomy of what is better and what is good and what is bad. But then you could watch The Hangover Part 2 and unlock some, very profound ideas about the human condition. And you could watch 2001 and think, oh, wow, this is a cool space movie. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of really interesting how that sense of coming to the work of art itself is a sort of process that we have to engage with. Because that feeds into the way that we make hierarchies, I think, as much as the work of art itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think the idea of hierarchies is where I don't see, is where I think, it's that argument again. I think I used this idea with when we were talking about gatekeepers. Are you upset with the very notion of power, or are you upset because you don't have power? I mean, and the same for me. I'm not hugely keen on the idea of hierarchies. The only useful thing that I can see coming from that is in the sense of recommendations and negative recommendations. Don't waste your time. This isn't any good. It is really, really interesting, and I think this is something that I feel especially as the old white male straight guy. I'm not, although working class, which obviously gets dropped out of the conversation because that's the last thing anybody wants.
Which it shouldn't, because I'm the same. It's very important.
I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, at the fear of engaging the wrath of the culture, it's possibly more important than other, because when your economic situation really does underpin all of the other kind of identity oppressions that you might experience. For me, again, that's easily countermanded, I think, by somebody who's got a different experience. But you have to admit that, if you're black, if you're rich and black, you'll have a different experience than if you're poor and black. So, I think those things have to be taken into account when you consider the idea of where people's positions are.
Well, you only have to look at the upper echelons of the Tory party to see that there's absolutely no contradiction in being a person of color or gay or a woman, and having and being
an elite position in society.
Precisely. But we digress. Or do we? I don't know. I'm not sure. But yeah, I'm kind of more interested in a conversation in which I'm enthused about stuff, but I recognize that my enthusiasms are not necessarily relatable to a lot of people, so are not necessarily based on shared criteria. And going back to also what you said earlier about people, the difference between, say, cinephile audiences and more general audiences, if you like, I'm really interested in how I think there's a real validity in I overheard a conversation recently where someone said, why would I do that? Why would I read that book? It's depressing, And I just thought, yeah, that's absolutely valid, you know. Absolutely. And I also, I love horror movies, but I know people, including critics, who don't like horror movies, not because of any snobbery, but because they dislike being frightened. And that's I mean, there are movies which are disgusting, like what's the name of the Italian guy who's always disgusting? Fulci.
Right.
You know, his films aren't just scary. There are moments of real. Pasolini, obviously, with Salò. I can understand someone saying, "Look, I just don't want to watch something that's going to actually even potentially make me physically sick."
Sure.
I don't know where we put that in the critical conversation necessarily, but I think those things are valid to say. They don't necessarily, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue for me is those things have a right to exist,
right?
Even if I don't like them, and I think that we're in danger, both, ironically, from the right and parts of the left. I think where there is this sense of this doesn't conform to a certain ideological way of thinking, and therefore it shouldn't exist. Not I disagree with it, and here's why. But you know, you have the right to say it. I mean, again, it's such a minefield now because, you know, of course, we're in this era where a lot of stuff is put out there intentionally to misrepresent, to lie. And I think now we're getting honest works of art or honest intentions or honest critiques being lumped into that idea of, oh, you made this in bad faith to, you know, to upset me or to counter to my particular way of thinking, and therefore you're a bad person for doing that, and this thing shouldn't exist. I think there is a lot of that out there right now, which I think is really problematic. I mean, just back to your sort of that gatekeeping question in terms of, you know, your podcasting and ours, that I think that we share that attitude. And what's interesting, like say, for example, on the one hand, I don't think you could say that us on the Cinematologists are gatekeepers in the fact that we don't have a big house to have a gate in front of. You know, we're not the BBC, so they are gatekeepers in that sense. But however, as you said there, we're similar in the sense that there is an expectation of a certain type of understanding, or at least an openness to engage with it, right? And if you're, you know, if you're just after fun banter for half an hour about the latest Marvel movie, you're just not going to get that. And that's our, perhaps, you know, you could call it elitism, but I don't see elitism in a bad way, but it's just a sort of sense of we want to have a conversation in a certain type of way, and we want to engage in culture and certain aspects of culture in a certain type of way. And that's what it is. And it's not negating, you know, the fan podcasts of Star Wars or whatever. That's totally cool. You know what I mean? And it's not even saying that where you should come to us for the real knowledge and go over there for your fun. You know what I mean? It's kind of like a sense of these are cultural approaches to the world. And those people who make those podcasts, they engage in culture and have political opinions, which are valid and all of those kinds of things. And they see that through that particular type of lens. And you could say that, you know, watching French art house movies is as much a kind of fan process as watching the latest Marvel movie. It's just a kind of what floats, what for whatever reason it is, ineffable reason, floats your particular boat.
Absolutely. I feel that there is a sort of film broization of art house, to tell you the truth. I think there is I find it so there's you know, I don't mean to knock anybody else's enthusiasm, by all means do, but there's a recent trait of, there's a Girls on Tees thing about, you know, people wearing t-shirts with, like, you know, Claire Denis written on them or something like that. And I kind of find that sort of daft. Yeah, I mean, knock yourselves out, but it just feels and the whole discourse around the whole use of the word discourse, for instance, the whole conversation around, you know, drive my car, and Parasite. I mean, I love Parasite. Parasite was great, but the fact that you're celebrating him winning the Oscars, don't you think the Oscars are a whole pile of bullshit? So you can't have it both ways. And Drive My Car was a really good example of that sort of being pushed to its extremes. I loved the film. I love that director. He's amazing. He's a great. He made a better film the year after, but the way they were Drive My Car was being pushed as this like, wow, it's it should win the Oscar. It was just like, you guys are deluded. It's it's you're trying to create a thing, and
that's the problem with the Oscars rather than what the films represent. I think I love Drive My Car, and if it was going to win any awards, that's fine with me. But my problem is the idea of you set a benchmark by the Oscars, which is clearly first of all, it doesn't know what it is these days. That's one thing. It doesn't know if it wants to cater to the mass audience or if it wants to consider itself arty and in the know. And B, again, it goes back to the Sight and Sound top 10. And you'd have to be much more clear about what your criteria is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I do think it does go a little bit beyond that, partly because of Twitter and social media, that people are trying to push whatever their particular enthusiasm is into something that sounds into sort of shapes that it doesn't fit, so you'll have people going, oh, I'm having a double bill of the Dardans tonight, here we go, and you're just like, what? Exactly, what? Oh, I don't know, it's about,
isn't that social media kind of like performativity, let's say, you know what I mean? Of my credentials as a film person.
Yeah, but it kind of, and I probably am as guilty as anybody else of doing it.
We have podcasts, mate. We can't get away from it. I'm sorry.
Oh my God. A friend of mine showed me an advert from Viz, which today I tweeted, actually. You have to go back a few days to find that tweet now. In the future, when you're listening to this, dear listener, but it's a fake advert for a product called Podcast Begone, and it's like a spray, and it's like, is your husband thinking of chatting for half an hour with his mate Dave about the political situation? Yeah. Podcast Begone, and or pop some under his pillow or something. And I do think that is I think that is the flip side of what you're talking about the popularity of podcasts. Is there is sometimes an element of like exit through the gift shop, where Banksy realizes that the idea that anybody can do art is not necessarily a good thing.
Sure. And what's interesting is that we're, if people have ever listened to our show, we do reflect on what we're doing a lot. It's kind of like, is this any good? In fact, and the fact that we're two white guys as well, we work very hard to have a lot of different voices on and not be bantery, because that just doesn't interest us at all. But again, it goes back to that thing of, if someone could, like I saw somebody tweeting once, look, I'm never ever going to listen to a podcast with a male voice on it again. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But you are potentially missing out on hearing something interesting, you know what I mean? And I think, again, that problematic element of deciding I'm not going to engage with something because already there is a criteria around it. I mean, I could say, like, say, for example, I'm not a huge fan of horror movies.
Right.
And it's not for the fear factor.
Yes,
Again,
it is. Yes, it is.
That scare the shit. It's just kind of like, what it is I actually do find that ability to suspend your disbelief and that to feed into a sense of your own psyche doesn't kind of work for me. I'm just kind of like, well, it's just somebody, behind the window, and you wouldn't don't walk out there on your own. That you wouldn't do that. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. However, I like the use of the horror tropes to undermine and play around with genre, I think is really interesting. I mean, I love A Ghost Story, one of my favorite films of the last 20 years. I went to see Nope the other day, which I thought was really interesting, really imaginative, playing around with generic iconographies and conventions and and what have you. Yeah.
Yeah, this is what's a little bit, and yeah, we don't want to go into is political correctness gone mad, but there is when somebody says I'm not going to listen to a male voice anymore, that's just silly. That's just daft. You're making your own argument. You're becoming a straw person for other people who oppose your ideas for worse reasons. You're giving them a gift. It's wrong from it's just daft. It's just like saying I'm not going to eat.
But even more than that, it's undermining the idea of progressive politics.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, I'm a progressive, and I'd like to consider myself quote unquote an ally. Maybe I'm a bad one. Right. But, I'm still on the side of, absolute equality of opportunity for everyone, not necessarily equality of outcome, because I think equality of opportunity is it leads to, at least hopefully a more a meritocratic art world or educational system or whatever you might say. Now, some people might say that's totally naive, because with thousands of years of oppressions, then you have to debalance it the other way, so to speak. But I think that we should be able to like you've sort of articulated there, almost look at what we see out in culture with innocent eyes. And it sounds idealistic and it sounds wishy-washy, but at least to have good faith when we engage with art or engage with somebody else who has a conversation. I think that's one of the big problems is, from both perspectives, from both sort of left and right-wing perspectives, why we're in such a polemic situation is that people come to a conversation with expecting bad faith on the other side. Like you are saying something and it's Machiavellian, it's surreptitious. You are just doing that to try and undermine me. And it's like, no, and don't get me wrong, there are people who are out there like that. I mean? For Christ, they're everywhere. That's the problem, but that then gets... that's a brush that is painted to everyone. So every kind of white male straight talker must have this kind of intent behind them. And maybe it's structural, maybe it's systemic, and there are those issues. We have this privilege that other people don't have. But I think, from my perspective and the way that I talk, there is an intention to be, open-minded and to be accepting of everything. And on the podcast and a lot of the conversations we have, we actually say we've got you on because we're learning.
Yeah.
I think is really important,
Yeah, that is definitely, anybody who's listened to more than one episode of this will learn that I am learning from a position of incredible weakness. But I think you're absolutely right when you're talking about as progressives, and I would characterize myself hopefully in that way. What I also probably would characterize myself, I mean, this isn't necessarily an ideological position or anything like that, but I would kind of go anywhere. I would kind of watch anything,
Yeah. Same here.
I don't see I would read anything. I am promiscuous and amoral at the moment of sort of reception. I'll open myself up to all sorts of things. I mean, this goes back to sort of, I think this partly goes back to the fact that in the 1970s, I couldn't get stuff. So just the fact that it's accessible now makes me want to do it. The first time I flew, I was 28 years old. So that makes me want to go to every possible place, even some places where I've been, which have terrible human rights records, for instance, which I've received criticism for, and I'm absolutely willing to engage in those arguments as well. So it just makes me feel very strange when people are shutting themselves off from that material, because my receiving it, my reading the book, watching the film, watching the video, whatever, is not an endorsement. And and how can I tell how? The other thing, I think we're maybe the same age, or probably a little bit younger, perhaps.
I'm late 40s, so
yeah, I'm 50. I'm the big 50.
Right, got a couple of years left.
Yeah, I've become a code for the police. That's how old I am.
All right.
Let's go back to our Wire viewing earlier. I grew up in the 70s. I grew up as a child. I was brought up as a Catholic. We had Society for the Prevention of for the Protection of the Unborn Child come into our school and show us abortions videos. I was very into the Legion of Mary and very into, I was obviously what would now be considered pro-life, but I would call anti-abortion. I changed my mind about that. I had conversations, I had arguments. It wasn't easy, it wasn't immediate, but I changed my mind. I know the cognitive feeling of thinking one thing with utter conviction, going through a change, and getting to the other side. And even though I might think this women have a right to choose, with the similar utter conviction, it is a conviction which also includes the memory of being convinced of its opposite.
Yeah.
I don't feel that people are willing to undergo those changes or to even to use that knowledge. I think it's a good thing that I changed my mind about so much stuff. I think it's a good thing that I have learned, because I feel my position is on more solid ground ultimately. So when I watch, when I hear about people not watching Polanski, not watching Woody Allen, and all these arguments, all of which have very, very separate things, but usually get mushed together, I just think you have to sort of appreciate to some degree the effect of culture and history on people's lives. And you have to also allow that they might have changed. And even if they haven't changed, they might still have valid things to say.
Yeah. God, there's a lot to unpack there. I'll come back to the sort of beginning of that in a minute.
On part 3 of Writers on Film.
I mean, my view on the whole Woody, let's just call it the Woody Allen thing or the Polanski thing, that sense of there is an artist who has done things in their lives that therefore have poisoned your sense of watching.
Okay, in that case, let's definitely call it the Polanski thing, because Woody Allen is still open to argument, but Polanski was convicted.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But again, that's one of the problems, is that there is a sort of sense of he definitely did it, therefore, I mean? Even with, that's one of the problems, you're projecting onto things that actually it's still, again, it's still up in the air what all that actually means. It's so complicated. Anyway, if people don't want to engage with that stuff, that's fine. That's entirely up to them, because I choose not to engage in stuff for loads of different kinds of weird reasons. You know what I mean? But then I also kind of think that you have to be aware when you say, what I don't like is when somebody is self-righteous about, if I want to watch the latest Woody Allen film, I'm somehow a bad person. And also the idea, you can turn that around and say, okay, name me say if you said to somebody, name me your top 10 films. I bet if I went and researched all of those top 10 films, I could find somebody who worked on those projects who didn't conform to your high moralistic bar. So, if you start pushing that to just a little bit, you get to the point where you can't watch anything, you can't listen to anything, and you can't read anything, right? So that's my issue with that. So you have to give, again, it's about good faith. You have to offer the person who wants to go and watch Woody Allen or Polanski the good faith, or assume that they have the good faith, that they know they have the reasons why they're watching them and they understand the context. Now, the counter to that might be, well, a lot of people don't. They're not self-reflexive in that way, but you still have to offer them that opportunity. You have to afford them that openness. I'm sorry, there's no other way, because otherwise it becomes banning books very quickly. Or burning books very quickly, And just back to the first point there, where you're talking about kind of being raised in a religious background and then, having that opinion of abortion and changing your mind. I think it becomes one of the things, I think that is the irony about the internet and the information age, to use that old-fashioned term, is that it has actually led to an embedding of people's embedded positions. It's led them to kind of like cling on to that ideas, because everything suddenly becomes so open, and so the possibility of change and the uncertainty means that people want to cling on to certainties. And I think that's something that has happened. And I would consider myself somebody, again, who would try to look at, not just look at the evidence, but reflect on the perspectives that people have about things. Now, it's funny because I come from a completely different background, in the fact that from ever since I can remember, I've always been an atheist. I've always been hugely skeptical, and even kind of anti the idea of spirituality in my youth. You know, I like Christopher Hitchens is one of my great, you know, loves as a writer. And, you know, I was really down with a lot of his kind of quite, you know, fundamentalist atheism for a period of time. But as I've gotten older, I've sort of come to the realization that actually I do enjoy kind of contemplative sides of life, you know, whether it's just thinking about, okay, you know, what makes me feel good is not necessarily something I can conceptualize in a cerebral way, you know, and that sense of the unknown, or that sense of the ineffable, is something that I've begun to engage with a lot more. And it's definitely not aligned with any kind of organized religion, but it's definitely aligned with the idea that, you know, there is something beyond the immediate rational that we take for granted to define how we negotiate the world around us, you know?
You know, Christopher Hitchens is up in heaven giving you the thumbs up. It's like, I was wrong, Dario. You're absolutely right. No, I mean, yeah, that's interesting that you've sort of had a slightly different journey. Although we're probably at exactly the same place now, by the sounds of it. But I mean, also in terms of like cultural history and context, to bring it back to films, there are so many movies that within themselves have sort of despicable sort of scenes or ideas or lines or characters or the people who are supposed to be. I mean, I remember in the 70s there was a huge trait of movies where or maybe more the 60s and 70s, where the main male character would proudly say, I'm a male chauvinist, I'm proud of it. And you were supposed to go, well, yeah, he knows how to talk to the ladies. And that was considered, you know, we grew up, you know, if culture and film has any effect, it's in sort of, yeah, reflecting society as it is, but also teaching the people who are coming along and just arriving, this is how you react, this is how you behave, this is how, when a policeman asks you a question, this is how you're supposed to respond. Often those things are inaccurate from an ideological point of view because they're trying to push something. Often they're inaccurate from just art is always fucking inaccurate point of view, in the sense that, you know, for instance, life is not terribly dramatic, and drama has to dispense with much of life in order to keep our attention. You know, the best example of this is sort of, you know, Man Bites Dog. Man Bites Dog is a story. So we don't have lots of stories about dogs biting men because that's not interesting. It's the reversal that's interesting. So you don't have loads of films in the 80s in which a man stalks a woman and, you know, it has a terrible effect on her life and destroys things and maybe even tries to kill her, because that's actually what happens a lot in reality. What you have instead is Michael Douglas being stalked by Glenn Close. And, yeah, I mean, Michael Douglas was a little bit the Bechdel test for this sort of film. You know, he did the same thing with Disclosure and harassment at work. Yeah. You know, that you could argue, that's an ideological thing. And it certainly is supportive of a very negative ideological, you know, construct of masculinity and misogyny. But it's also kind of the way drama works. Hey, you know what would be really interesting? What if, you know, I mean, you can imagine someone in the 1980s looking at the Weinstein affair and saying, yeah, that's interesting, but what if we make the starlet who's really ambitious, what if we make her the villain and make the producer the victim? You know, you can imagine, I can imagine that film. It wouldn't be made today, but it would be made in the 80s, and it would probably star Michael Douglas.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is one of the kind of issues, I think, today, where you hear that phrase a lot, it wouldn't be made today. Now, you know, and I kind of agree with it. There's a lot of great and problematic films that wouldn't be made today. And you've got to kind of engage, well, why? What is it about that? Is, you know, is it just due to the changes in the film industry and the economic structures of it. Potentially, I think that's part of it. I think potentially there's an aversion to things that are experimental or outside of formulaic patterns, because directors and executives don't know how to sell that to audiences. So therefore, you could argue, are audiences less, again, it sounds really condescending, but less kind of critically sophisticated, and not even critically, but sophisticated in their ability to enjoy works of art that are outside prescribed formula. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
recognizing IP.
Yeah. And like, my favorite era of cinema is the 70s as well. And it sounds like a cliche. And people will say, and I agree with this, but there was so much shit that was made in the 70s as well. I said, yeah, that's true. But you needed all of that shit to be made for the good stuff to come out. And it was a certain kind of shit. It was shit that didn't have any rules. The problem is today we have shit that is prescribed. You know what I mean? It has to have this, and this. And it has to, link back to other kinds of media that it has to have the Easter eggs in. And it has to remind the audience of something that they saw 20 years ago. You know what I mean? And it has to have these kind of constructions of narrative and exposition so that the audience understands exactly what's going on at all times, So it's kind of like it's like a slurry versus processed shit. And I think the slurry kind of is great because it fertilizes creativity, you know what I mean? And you could say the same thing about podcasting and what's happened to that. There was there, don't get me wrong, there are millions of podcasts out there which are just two people wanging on in a really sort of self-indulgent kind of way. But there are some really
that's just rude that you're saying that on my podcast.
No, but there is, but we are that too at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then, within that as well, then that allows for that sort of lack of boundaries, allows for experimentation, which suddenly something great comes out of that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I agree with what you say about the cinema of the 70s. It is, the shit that happens will always have John Cassavetes in a small role popping up, and you'll be like, whoa! And it also, there is the nostalgia of just looking at filmed objects from the 1970s, people picking up phones and sort of, going to, those Dino-mats. Do you remember those? Where they have food coming from an automatic? Amazing. One thing I would correct from something you said earlier on, and I'm sure it was I would include Jaws in the New Hollywood rather than say it was coming after.
Oh yeah, it's New Hollywood adjacent, isn't it?
I would say it's absolutely solidly New Hollywood. It's the Nixonian paranoia, Larry Vaughn, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I for those reasons for sure. But again, I think that there is that sense of it becoming, in budgetary terms and also audience, diversity in terms of like the size of the audience aim, I think is that's when it starts to move into other areas, when you get to Star Wars and you get to Raiders of the Lost Ark. And, and even, the one film that kind of gets lost in that transitional period, I think, is Rocky. Rocky was absolutely fundamental in sort of that moment of the American hero post-Vietnam suddenly being the underdog and coming back and winning out, the underclass kind of kid. And again, it says problematic things about race, I think, the idea that the champion reflects something about what the white man has lost, you know what I mean, with this black figure at the top. You know what I mean? There's so many kind of, but again, that's why Rocky's a great movie, because you can look at it in those terms. It offers you a lot to think about.
Yeah, some of the language that we have to use these days, I think, is partly the problem in terms of the linguistic determinism of certain phrases that are rather, ironically, uncritically applied by the critical community. So problematic is one of them, where it's just like, of course, everything's problematic and nothing's problematic. If everything is, then nothing is. So, tropes I find as one of those that irritate me. And then
there's a lot borrowed from academia as well. Like something like the male gaze is just applied to any time there's a woman on screen.
Yeah.
now, you know, oh, this woman on screen is subject to the male gaze. And actually you have, you know, it's being used as simply a shorthand, when if you go back to the original text, there's a lot going on there in terms of psychology and the notion of voyeurism and fetishism, and cinema as a machine to set that up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of what these things, as you said, male gaze, auteur theory is another.
Yeah.
Recently, I was talking to the author of The Method, Isaac Feldberg, I want to say. Anyway, right. I'll correct it in the show notes. But anyway, the author of The Method, I had a great interview with him. And his book is all about how everybody thinks the method is this, and it just isn't. It's just that's not the method. Yeah, Daniel Day-Lewis is doing research. He's not doing the method. That's I mean, actually, I was listened in on a Q&A with Mads Mikkelsen, and he was asked exactly this question, and he went, no, Daniel Day-Lewis is researching, and that's up to him, but it's not the method. The method is something else. The method is specifically about sense memory, and so I think there's that misunderstanding also. You know, when you have a lexicon, there's always a danger that those words become ossified and they're no longer flexible enough to accurately, describe what's going on in something which is so organic and so, I think you can talk about it. I'm not saying you can't talk about it, or you can't theorize about it, or you can't extrapolate. You can, of course you can. But it's the minute that you start to really lay down categories and taxonomies as if they are, they will never change in time.
No. And, I think a lot of it as well in the last 10 or 15 years is the fact that there is a limitless amount of digital space to fill.
Yeah.
It's last time I was at Berlin. I mean, we're really lucky on the podcast. It's not even luck. It's just the way that we're set up, that we have full-time jobs, and the podcast is a kind of adjacent to our academic interests, but it's also something we love to do. And when we go to Berlin, we're not under there's no editor telling us, you need to watch this film, and write 500 words on. And there's so many like young critics who are out there on their own dime, trying to write, very quick 500-word pieces, which, great, fine. If you love to do that, you want to be a film critic, go out and do that. But I was kind of amazed when I was looking at the press screening. I was in the press screenings and thinking, my God, how many of these people are actually going to be able to sustain themselves through writing these, 20 500-word reviews of Berlin for 50 quid each or whatever.
And 50 quid?
Well, I don't know. God knows how much they're getting paid. Some are not getting paid anything.
I would argue the vast majority are not getting paid anything.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Of that particular, if you're talking about that age bracket more than anything.
Yeah. No. So there is a diversity of different types of critics that are there. Some are unpaid, writing for internet
blogs
websites and blogs and what have you. But then there are some that are getting paid a little bit, and there's some that are getting paid depending on the institution they're writing for. But in my mind, I'm thinking, are you all thinking that you're aiming towards getting a newspaper column? Because there's like 8 available, do you know what I mean? And those people are going to die before they relinquish those posts. And it's kind of like, I think to myself, where is film criticism going within that context? And, I have these pretensions sometimes where it's just like, oh, do you know what? I'd be love to quit my academic job and just podcast and just write. And it's just like, and then I think about it for 2 seconds and I'm like, no, that's not going to happen, because it's just it's impossible,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's nice to keep your feet in 2 different worlds as well. I mean, sure. I'm teaching at university, and I not so much for the teaching aspect, but for the student aspect. I just like interacting with people who are in their 20s, and there's so many things that if I stayed in my room and didn't come out, I would have my opinions from that were formed in the 80s and 90s would still be applied to a world that no longer even exists. I mean, I'll give you a very quick example of that. Is like most of my students, when you'd go in 20 years ago and you'd say, what's your favorite sort of like TV show or film or something, the science fiction nerds would be boys. And nowadays, the science fiction nerds are all girls, because they all watch, they've been brought up on Harry Potter and Twilight and Hunger Games. And so the number of girls who love science fiction with as much, if not more intensity than the lads, is 50+% of the people at least in my, obviously I'm just talking about my university classes, but that's a huge shift compared to what it was when I was growing up. It was zero. No girls were into that.
And it really has affected that, exactly that experience that I have as well. Once I get past all of the bullshit, university crap that you have to deal with in terms of admin and all that kind of stuff, once you actually get into the room, I'm always reminded of why I do the job. Do you know?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it really does. It's changed my kind of teaching practice in many ways. In the last few years, particularly, I've kind of reassessed myself and what I'm trying to do, because I think that I got to the point where I was saying things and just getting blank looks in terms of referencing. Do you know what I mean? Oh, this film or that film. So the first thing you have to do is recognize that these kids haven't seen the things that you've seen.
Yeah.
And therefore they're not informed by it. Right. So therefore you have to say, okay, so what are they informed by? And then you have to, admit and appraise that you have to come to them and where they are. And then the other thing is, even if you don't like, they love Marvel movies and they love DC and they love Star Wars and stuff like that. And I feel like it's not that I don't love them. It's feel like I've grown out of them, honestly. And it sounds, again, sort of condescending, but it's just I'm looking for other things at my age and in my position. But how do you get around that as a teacher? How do you remain a good teacher? What you say is, okay, explain to me why you like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. And it's kind of like, is it just about, so they might just say, oh, I just love it. And I feel like this one. And it's okay. So it's about pleasure and it's about a kind of physical experience. And then others will say, well, I see myself in this character. And instead of saying, somebody flying around in a spandex uniform, you see yourself in that character. Okay. So why? What is it about that character that you see? And then you can kind of talk about things like, well, this character's kind of explaining their feelings. Have you seen this film where this character has the same feelings, but they don't explain it? It's told visually or it's told sonically. And you can get them, interested in the kind of sophistication of filmmaking from their position of where they are. And I think that's the way in today's culture and the way that the content works and it's brought to them. Everything's brought to them instantly. So that you have to go to them where they are rather than sort of saying, you don't know anything. Come to where I am, where I know shit. They do know, they know loads of shit, and you just don't know the shit that you know. And they know things in different ways. So that's where education, I think, has to kind of adapt.
I think if we take that back to what you were talking about, going to the Berlinale and having your experience of looking and seeing all these sort of 20-somethings or young critics. I had a recent conversation with a friend of mine who we were in Cannes. I'll keep his name out of it, actually, so he doesn't get into trouble for this comment. But we were looking around, and of course, we're slightly older. Well, we're twice the age of a lot of these people. And I was saying, sometimes I find it difficult to engage with these people. They don't seem to be as sort of forthcoming or as open as I wish they were. No, and it was kind of unusual, because usually people, I'm quite good at having conversations with people, despite the evidence. And he said, well, they're intimidated. And I was like, well, what do you mean they're intimidated? They're writing for, big outlets. Why are they intimidated by me? And he said, well, because they haven't seen as many films. They haven't been on the earth long enough. They just haven't, seen the depth of films that you've seen. You've let's face it, we watch 300-400 plus films a year. Well, I mean, probably 500 films a year, maybe. And you've been on the earth watching films for 44 years or 47 years or however long it's been. You've just amassed a body of knowledge that you can draw on plus books, plus music, plus living through historical time, plus having experiences like the Berlin Wall falling, Mandela being released, South Africa not descending into a bloodbath, but coming out as an operating democracy when nobody predicted that. So this gives a certain depth to your perspective and your outlook, or can do. If you're 23, 24, and yes, you've seen the Dardenne brothers, and yes, you've seen Fassbinder on a box set, and yes, but you just haven't had time to get the amount of stuff that someone has. And you're living in a culture which does not really forgive or allow you to just say, I don't know much about this,
Yeah. You have to have confidence to say that as well.
Yeah, because otherwise it's like the imposter syndrome. People are sort of like, oh, I got the imposter syndrome. No, you're great. No, we're all fucking imposters. You should have the imposter syndrome. It's a valid psychological reaction to your position in the world and its insecurity. You are an imposter.
That's the problem, that we're governed by people who don't have the imposter syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah. The worst, are filled with fiery. The best lack all conviction, the worst are filled with fiery passion, as Yeats said. Or I think he was quoting Shelley, who said it better, because he said the good want power, the powerful goodness want.
Yeah.
That's
a very poetic example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, isn't it? That idea of the less you know, the more certain you are. And that's the imposter syndrome. It's like imposter syndrome is afflicting people who know a fucking lot of stuff.
It should be a qualification. It's like if you've got the imposter syndrome, it means you're exactly where you ought to be.
For sure.
Listen, Dario, as you can tell, we could stretch this conversation. Well, we wouldn't even have to stretch it. We've been cramming it, and it could go on for hours and hours. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, but I have to ask you one final question, which I'm sure you are prepared for. Otherwise, you're going to be in trouble with your students next time you demand any homework. What's your recommended film book?
Well, I've got one that is in fact, I've got plenty, because I've been reading quite a few film books over time. Probably my all-time favorite film academic book is called Camera Politica by Douglas Kellner and Michael Ryan. And I think it's about, if you're into 70s movies, it's great because it kind of covers the 50s to the 70s. And it's basically almost a kind of manual about how to write about film and engage with the social and cultural politics of the time. So I would definitely recommend that for sure. Just in terms of a great read, this summer I read a fictional book called The Diary of a Film by Niven Govindan. And it's basically a fictional tale of a film director who is a kind of European art house auteur. And he's at an Italian festival, which is probably something akin to Venice. And he's releasing his new film. And he's with his two male co-stars. So it's almost kind of like I think the film is sort of like a Call Me By Your Name type movie that this guy's made. But he encounters this woman who is a forgotten writer. And she kind of they walk around. It's all set in the days of leading up to his premiere, right? And she walks around the city with him and reveals her relationship to this artist. And she takes him to this mural that her artist ex-lover, before they got married, painted because he died. And that kind of fueled her entire melancholy and her writing career, which was then subsequently forgotten. And it's really interesting and it goes into kind of like the filmmaking process and the nature of how you define art through life. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book to read when you've got that time on holiday. It was just absolutely the perfect read. So yeah, those probably, I mean, I can give you a list of many, many more, but we've been going on, as you say, for a couple of hours. So those two to start with.
Yeah, it will be, well, I mean, I guess you and Neil sort of with the podcast, there's a constant sort of stream of recommendations going on, both for films and books and arguments. So it's, I mean, that's what I've loved doing this podcast is, the best reaction I get is people posting photographs of recently purchased books because they listen to an episode and they said, I've just got this because of because of the episode. And it's like, that's exactly what I want. I want people to read more books.
Yeah. And Jason Bailey's Fun City Cinema table book is really worth getting as well, which accompanies the podcast, which is a great film podcast.
Yeah, it's superb, and he did a great. Had a great interview and a great conversation. I think in September. I think when it came out. Yeah, quite some time ago. But it was. He's a brilliant guy. And really, he really knows his stuff.
On Twitter as well.
But there's a sort of. Him and another friend of mine, Glenn Kenny, have a very particular sort of New York, I'm walking here Twitter.
They do. Yeah, that's it for sure.
I love it. It's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Dario. It's been an absolute joy, and I'm looking forward to having future conversations, because it sounds like you're going to have a book coming out. So I'm gonna grab you and get you back on. Maybe we can have you and Neil on one of these days, and then
that would be interesting for sure. Because we definitely, we can talk more about kind of like dynamics of conversation and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Excellent, brilliant. Thanks, Dario.
No problem. Anytime. Take care.
So that was my conversation with Dario. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we obviously did. I really think we could have talked for like 2 or 3 or 4 hours. I think it just there are so many issues there to get to the bottom of, and I really enjoy talking to someone like Dario, who's so obviously thought about these issues for quite a long time, much longer than my asinine, half-arsed observations. So I really hope you got something from that conversation. I'm pretty sure you did. All that remains for me to do is thank Elliot Atkins for the music, and Ali Harwood for the artwork. Over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be in Venice at the film festival. This has been a heavy summer of festivals. I hope you don't think I'm just doing humble brags by this, but it has been enormous fun, so I guess I am doing humble brags. However, I'm hoping to set up at least another 2 episodes so that the podcast will continue a little bit more regularly than it has done already. If I don't, that's my bad, I guess. This is the 70th episode, by the way. So my final thanks has to go to you, the listener. You have been a constant and dedicated presence, and there are more of you than there were at the beginning, which is always a very good sign. Until the next time, take care.